here's Barb. Have fun hanging out with her.
Okay. Go home, have a nap. Okay, so today for Technic Tuesday, we are going to talk about preparing your quilt top for long arming. We've had a lot of people asking, are we still taking quilts in, and what do I have to do to get my quilt ready? But it will help us if you have your quilt well prepared for us. So I like to say when people bring their quilts in, my job is to make their work look spectacular. So I've quilted quilts for beginners right up to experts, and I've learned a few tips along the way. So we decided to put this together into kind of a little, not really a demo, kind of a little discussion, a chat. And you have to think in terms of good, better, and best when it comes to getting your quilt top ready. Because I have quilted some not so good quilts, and they're still quiltable. So we don't want to worry too much about the quality of the piecing. The long arm machine does not care if your points don't match or if your colors aren't right in style. But the long arm machine does a much better job of your quilt with a few tips that I'm going to pass on to you. So, first off, prepare things right. When you get your fabric home, whether you pre-wash or do not pre-wash it, and I would say we're up to about 80% of quilters do not pre-wash their fabrics. I always do. I come from a clothing sewing background, and so I always pre-wash my fabric. But if you don't pre-wash your fabric, at least give it a nice press, make it nice and flat to work with. If you do pre-wash your fabric, please don't use scented fabric softeners or scent beads in your dryer. A lot of long armers are sensitive to the perfumes in things. So you don't want us to have to take your quilt and hang it outside for a day and a half to let some of the scent drift away. So that's the first tip. Then you're going to cut your quilt out. You're going to piece your quilt top. So first of all, we're going to prepare our fabric right. Secondly, we're going to sew our quilt top right. Now that doesn't mean we're going to be perfect at it. We're going to do the best we can. So the first thing, as you're sewing all those lovely pieces of fabric together, check your seams as you sew to make sure you haven't got a little, you know what it's like when you're sewing along here and sewing along, and then you look and oops, that underneath piece of fabric has shifted over and you've just caught 3 threads. That's when your seam ripper comes out, and you just take that part out and restitch it. Okay? Because there's nothing worse when we've got that quilt under the long arm to have that machine stitching a pattern and have that foot get caught in that open seam and tear a hole in your quilt. So you want to make sure as you sew, you check each seam to make sure you have caught all the fabrics nicely. This is my sample of not quite well prepared quilt. If you're making, okay, let's not jump too far ahead. Next point I have on the list is put your borders on properly. If you talk to any long armor, one of the prime problems they run into is what we call wobbly borders. That is, when you've got fabric and you're stitching it, every stitch is going to pull that fabric in a little bit. So on a big quilt, that whole quilt is going to get gradually smaller, which means when you get down to the bottom of your quilt, if you have done, as I used to do, sew that border fabric on and cut off what we don't need, you're going to end up with a quilt that's basically barrel shaped. And you're going to end up with a border at the bottom that does the lovely wavy thing up and down. It's amazing how much extra fabric we get in bottom borders in particular, and quite often in side borders as well, because we're working with fabric that moves and flexes. We're not working with concrete and steel. So you have to remember to put your borders on correctly. But I'm going to walk you through it really simply. It's not hard. You prepare your quilt center just like this. Then you get your tape measure and you measure across the center and you write down that number. Then you go up halfway between the center and the top, take that measurement and do the same thing down here. So now you have 3 numbers, and they are likely not all the same. Add them together and divide by 3, and that's going to give you an average of the width of your quilt. You're going to prepare your border fabric, whether you're piecing it straight on or with a diagonal, doesn't matter. And you're going to cut a length of border fabric, that figure that you've calculated. So that might be, you know, if the top edge of your quilt was 73 and your average measurement was 72.5, that's a ½ inch. So now you've got your border fabric cut to the measurement that you want. You're going to take the top edge of your quilt and pin your border fabric in this corner, and in the center. You can fold things in half to find the center, and then fold it again to find the next center. Put pins all the way along, easing the quilt to fit the border fabric. Then you're going to sew that seam. You don't have to, if it's a really big quilt, I might almost be inclined to start in the center and stitch out just for ease. But you can start at your pin and sew carefully across, gradually easing that fabric in to fit the border. When you're all done, you're going to press that seam towards your border. You're going to repeat that for the bottom of your quilt. So that's got your top and bottom borders on. Now you're going to repeat the whole process, and you're going to measure your quilt, including the borders, up through the center and then in 2 other places. Cut your side borders that measurement. Mark the centers, pin them in place, and stitch them on. If you manage to get your borders on with that process, I can almost guarantee when that quilt is on the long arm, we're not going to have any problems with ripples and waves and puckers on the sides or the bottom or anywhere on that quilt. It's almost surprising how much extra fabric can appear in borders when we're working with customers' quilts. We'll get down to the bottom and we'll see that ripply border, and we usually phone the customer and give them a few choices. We can pleat the extra fabric and stitch over it. We can actually take the border off, smooth it back out and re-sew it, or we can have them do that. I can remember once a few years ago having to do that for a customer, and there was 5 inches of extra fabric in that bottom border. That's how much I took out. So that means when that border was being sewn on, that quilt top was being stretched out like that. Okay, borders. We have our quilt sewn. We have our borders on. Let's talk about pressing. Dawn's put up a lovely display of some of the things that we like. She even found some blue and white fabric because my samples are done with that. You need a good iron, and we sell them here. This is one of the handiest things that you can have beside you when you're sewing. This is the wool pressing mat. This is a good size because it's going to handle just about any size block that you're making. Another best friend, Mary Ellen's Best Press. And if you don't know what this is, it's like a fabric sizing. As I said, I'm a pre-washer, so I like to wash the factory sizing out of the fabric. And yeah, sometimes they're a little soft, but this stuff is great. And you're going to see when I show you close-ups of some of these guys here. And you can always make yourself a really nice ironing pad out of a piece of, we've got a board, we've got a little kit made up here for you. So you come to sew your quilt. This is an example of, well, you can see, just squares sewn together, completely unpressed. You can see how the seams, I tried to get some of the seams to flip over, but they didn't. So, and I have quilted quilts like this, but they don't always lay as flat as we would want. So what I like to do is press as I go. So we've got our quilt top. The next section on my handout says press it right. And I'm going to kind of deviate from the norm. So this block is completely unpressed. There we go. This one is the way that we have been taught, at least the way I was taught for making quilts. This has been pressed with all of the seams pressed to one side. You can see alternating directions. It lets you lock your corners so you get nice sharp points, and then everything pressed in this direction. Remember I said good, better, best? This is the middle. This is better. This is pretty good. Looks good, lays flat, and will quilt up quite nicely on that. So when I'm preparing something like this, I sew my blocks together in a row, I press them. So all of the rows are made and pressed, then the rows are sewn together and they're pressed. Instead of sewing everything together, and then you got to figure out, okay, which way do I want to press these guys, and then you get this sort of thing happening. So it's always a good idea to press as you go. But what I learned after starting here and working on very experienced quilters' quilts is I press all my seams open. And now I know, you go, okay, well, how am I going to match those corners? Might take you a little bit more time, but the results are definitely worth it. This is only 4 pieces of fabric meeting here. That's not too bad. But I had a lovely quilter bring her quilt in for longarming, and she gave me permission to show you just how effective it can be. Now this is one of our Jaybird quilts little patterns. You can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 seams. Let's move that just a bit further back, right there. 6 seams meeting in that point. Now, all of her seams are pressed open, and that center point is no thicker than out here or any of the others. Very little lumping, which means when my long arm is stitching across here, it's not going to have to jump over that hump of seams in the center. They're just beautiful, beautiful quilts to work on. So I went, that works pretty good. I'm going to start pressing all my seams open. And I tell people, press your seams open when you can. I ran into something of my own just recently. I had all my seams pressed open. I had some very intricate piecing, put my border on. There was no way I could press that border seam open. I had all of those pieces in there. So I pressed it towards the border. Sometimes we have to do that, but the more you can get those seams pressed open, the flatter your quilt top is going to lie, and the better it's going to look once it's quilted. So we've made our quilt top, we've got our borders on properly, we've pressed all of our seams open nice and flat. The last thing that we want to do, and you can probably see it right here on this blue square, is stay stitch around the edge of your quilt. Just about 1/8 of an inch in. Doesn't have to be straight, doesn't have to be fancy. It's going to be hidden by your binding. But what that's going to prevent, if you have no borders on your quilt, it's going to prevent those seams from opening. Let's pull this guy out. See, if I give that a little tug, you can see how that starts to pull open a little bit. If you do have borders on your quilt, it prevents that fabric from stretching as we move it around on the machine. It just keeps everything flat and square. It's lovely. I love them when they're stay stitched. So we've prepared it right, we've sewn it right, and we have pressed it right. Remember, when you're pressing your quilt, you're not sliding the iron back and forth. We're just lifting the iron and pressing it down. Lifting the iron and pressing it down, because we don't want to stretch that fabric in any way. Right? Now we get some people who say, well, should I use steam? I like to use a little bit of steam when my whole quilt is completely done. I don't use steam when I am pressing my seams open as I piece things. This guy is my go-to iron for quilting. Just a little travel iron. Lightweight. It will take steam if you want to, but I don't worry about it. But it's really handy. You get those blocks sewn together. You can just come along, press all those seams open, and then you're ready to sew them together. That's my go-to. And then when the whole quilt is finished and pieced, then I switch to the big iron, and I will use a little bit of steam on it. Just remember that steaming is going to stretch your fabric a little bit. That's another tip. If we do get the wobbly borders, sometimes we will steam those and then let them dry and let them shrink in gradually. So we've got our quilt top made, we've got it sewn together, we've got it pressed, we're about ready to take it to the long arm. One more thing to double check. Don't add embellishments, buttons or beads, even some of the hand embroidery things onto your quilt top until after we've done the long arming. Because if we're doing something with the computerized machine, and that machine's coming along, we don't want to run over a button and break your button or break our needle on the machine. If you have a quilt like some t-shirt quilts or memory quilts made out of shirts and you have open pockets or flanges on your borders, those lovely little things, I haven't done one, those are so cute. So buttons and beads, if your quilt has the flanges or the flaps or pockets or anything like that that you need special attention given to, make sure you point them out when you bring your quilt in. Say, I've got this quilt and I've got this lovely embroidered little label down here. Can you not quilt over that? Because our machines are wonderful and we can certainly, it's called crop out those areas. Not a problem. So we've got our quilt top, we've got it pressed, and we're ready, and we're going to bring it into the long arm. This is also a good time if you're a little concerned to add that Mary Ellen's Best Press, give your quilt a little bit of body. This quilter, I talked to her about it. She does not pre-wash her fabric, so it has a little bit of crispness left in it, and that's going to help it to lie flat. So you're all set. Fold it neatly, seams inward, tuck it in a bag, put it on a hanger, and drop it off to your long arm. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule. Things that don't count, things that don't matter or don't matter too much when it comes to long arming. The size of your quilt. The size of your quilt top is not as important as the size of your backing fabric. As long as I have a backing fabric that will fit on the machine, I can quilt pin cushions, placemats, table runners, anything. So nothing is too small, and when it comes to too big, our machine will handle a quilt top up to about, I would say, 110 inches wide. The length is almost infinite, but you know, there is still a limit on that once it goes on the roller. So we can handle the big king-size quilts easily with no problem at all. We don't worry about the shape of your quilt. And this one that's on the table is kind of a good example. I can hold it up. You can see, because of the pattern, that it has like an uneven edge to it. Some of the pieced quilts will actually have a zigzag edge, like this. That's okay, no problem. Tree skirts, they're round. Again, as long as I have a backing fabric that fits on the machine, I can quilt a different shape with no issues. Table runners are often like that. They'll be long and they'll have a point on the end. Doesn't present a problem to us. Fabrics. What do you make your quilt tops out of? Obviously, quilting cotton works great. Flannel works great. T-shirt quilts, we do a fair number of t-shirt quilts. That works great. They'll stitch through, our machines will stitch through most commercially available consumer goods. Once we get into the denims, we have to be a little more careful. Denim fabric, not a problem, but some of those heavy seams on denims we would have to avoid. So that might change how we quilt your quilt and how we treat it afterwards. If you're making a quilt top with knit fabrics like a t-shirt quilt, make sure those knits are stabilized with a fusible stabilizer in behind, so they're not going to stretch as they're quilted. The other thing that we don't really have a problem with, that I know people have asked me about, is things like fusible web type products, heat and bond, steam a seam, all that sort of stuff. They don't pose an issue for us. The machine will stitch right through them. The Laura Heine collage quilts that are so popular, that's sometimes we've got 4, 5, 6 layers of fused fabric, and the machine will handle that with no problem. Yeah, we get a little gummy stuff on the needle, but we just take some rubbing alcohol, clean the needle a little more frequently, and not a problem. Same thing with basting sprays. You don't have to use them. That's part of the blessing of having your quilt done by a long armer, is you don't have to put the layers together. But we do on occasion use a basting spray to help stabilize things, especially batting to fireside backings, and they don't bother the machine as well. So as I tell people, the long arm is a big, stupid sewing machine. It only does one thing. It just does it really, really fast. Goes up and down like this. It's a totally free motion. And because they're large and heavy and we use a fairly decent sized needle in them, we can handle just about anything when it comes to fabric. I hope that answers everybody's wonderings about the mysteries of long arming. What we're kind of planning on doing, we've talked about quilt tops. So next week, we're going to talk about preparing your quilt backing for long arming. And I have come to the conclusion that your backing is almost as important as your quilt top when it comes to the best possible finished result. It's amazing. It's amazing. I'll tell you some stories of some of the backings and things that I have quilted. You can quilt just about anything, but the better you prepare things, the better the results will be. So for today, Technique Tuesday, that's about it. Remember, be kind, be calm, be safe, everybody.